Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of the podcast. Today I'll be speaking with Chris Tatem. Chris hosts the Cross-Examine Life podcast. The Cross-Examine Life podcast improves the way we disagree with one another. Guests advance controversial opinions, and he ranks their position over the coals through Socratic cross-examination. Hi Chris, how are you?
Welcome I'm doing really well. How are you?
Not too bad. Thanks for coming on.
Sure. I'm excited about what you're doing here.
Dude, I'm excited to talk to you. When did you start doing the podcast, the Cross-Examine Life, and what kind of motivated you to have a podcast where you just debate people and kind of play devil's advocate?
Sure. It had its genesis around the 2016 presidential election in the United States, when it seemed to me that our ability to listen to people with whom we disagreed had sunk to new levels. And whether it was on social media or in person, we simply did not want to listen to the person who had an opposing viewpoint from our own. And I think nowhere was that more clear than when people woke up the morning after the election, and many people were quite surprised. And I think they talked a lot about living in echo chambers and hearing their own ideas fed back to them time and time again. And I said, we need to break free of this. We need to listen to people with whom we disagree. We need to hear opposing viewpoints. And so that's why every guest who comes on the show advances a viewpoint they feel strongly about. And then I challenge it, or I try to, poke holes. I try to rake them over the coals and ask the tough questions.
Right. Now, I've noticed that when you reach out to people for the show, you usually have a topic in mind. Do you research a topic and choose that beforehand? Or do people come to you with ideas? Or is it a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. But as a practical matter, I find that sometimes when you give people too many choices, they don't choose anything at all. And
Right.
So when I've said, who wants to come on the show and argue some position, I often get crickets. But when I say, who wants to come on and argue that couples should have one bank account as opposed to two, then I get a few takers.
Right. That makes sense. You're reaching out with one specific thing in mind instead of forcing people to figure out what they think is worth arguing about or what they feel like they can argue.
Exactly. I also try to put images with my posts, not only to boost their visibility, but so that people have some emotional reaction when they see the thing. And so if you see a photograph of NFL players kneeling, immediately that's going to create some sort of visceral response in you. And I want that response so that then you respond to the post and you say, yes, I want to argue for or against that position.
Right. Absolutely. It's interesting, the range, the scope of the topics that you to cover. Like you said, everything from the NFL kneeling to big travelers buying 2 seats on a plane to accommodate for their size. Things that are seemingly small issues, things that are obviously part of the national dialogue. It's
really
fascinating.
I think that some people might be dismissive and say, who needs to hear a debate about whether or not big travelers should buy 2 seats on a plane? And I often respond to that and I say, you know what, you're right. That's not the biggest issue facing our country at this point in time. And probably the answer to that question might not even be terribly important. But what is important is how we talk about it. What is important is if we can approach it in a civilized and respectful way, and if 2 people can actually advance opposing viewpoints about it in a way that doesn't disrespect the other person.
Right. It's the fact that the conversation is happening the way that it is. And I'm sure plenty of other things come up and the conversation can lead different directions to where you're learning all kinds of new things on both ends, just as people. That everything isn't directly related to big travelers buying 2 seats on a plane. Like, that is clearly a conversation about how we treat one another and how we think of the people around us. It's not just about the 2 seats.
Absolutely. In fact, I learned during that episode about the way that individuals who feel like they're, too big for a seat, or I've been told that they're too big for a seat, how they feel. And it never occurred to me that there was a whole sort of conversation around it, or maybe comments from other travelers on the plane. I could imagine maybe a small secret conversation with the, stewardess or something. But I mean, the guest talked about, multiple people in all different parts of the plane commenting about, where she wanted to sit. from her own experience.
Mhm.
And that really surprised me to sort of learn that maybe the level of oppression or the level of feeling bullied was much greater than what I had imagined.
Absolutely, and not to focus so much on what we agreed seems like a minor issue at first, but I think that it really encompasses the lack of understanding between people that's going on right now. That is the root of so many issues politically. That is probably the root of the surprise that came with the 2016 presidential election. Just because we were surprised because we weren't listening to each other, we didn't address the reality of the situation and have conversations. And I
Yeah,
think that. That episode, as small as the issue seems at first, really speaks to that divisiveness, that lack of um, respect and understanding for people around you, because that is to me seems like a prerequisite for having a meaningful conversation with somebody.
absolutely. And, as a lover of philosophy, I have to say another prerequisite is approaching a conversation with similar definitions
Mm-hmm.
and understandings of what words are. And so that's why episode 11 remains one that fascinates me the most, where my guest didn't want to talk about whether or not terrorism was or wasn't a problem. My guest was saying that we shouldn't be using this term because there is no agreement as to its meaning. And so she
Right.
was saying in our conversations, in our back and forth and debates, we need to stop using the word terrorism because there's an impossibility of arriving at a consensus about what it really means. And so it's kind of meaningless to discuss. And that episode continues to fascinate me every time I listen to it because it's
Have you
really,
seen? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sort of gets to the fundamentals of what a difficult conversation is. And that is, the definitions and what people understand those words to mean.
Yeah, absolutely. The word terrorism is defined differently depending on which political camp you're in. At least conversationally. Um, Have you seen the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, where they end up just debating about what the definition of truth is for an hour and a half?
I love that so much, and I even listened to the part two of it, which was not
I
as
haven't listened to
entertaining,
part
but
two
still
yet.
fascinating.
Right, I haven't listened to part two yet. The first one was only entertaining because of how frustrating it was. So,
It was just as a sort of tangential matter. Can I ask if you sort of sided with one of them or another?
I think each definition needs the other, but I lean more towards Peterson. I would say, but I often do that. Like even in terms of worldview, I lean towards the viewing the world through a lens of function and interaction and meaning and purpose and story more than towards material. But I try to acknowledge that each needs the other, more and more.
I love that answer. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. Which side do you think you lean more towards?
I think the opposite side. I think I tend to be more material and interested in the outcomes that are possible based on the resources available at a given moment in time, and trying to maximize outcomes based on resources and efficiencies. So, yeah, kind of two competing philosophies of life, you might say.
There you go. But they interact with each other in really interesting ways, and they collide in a way that produces what is hopefully a functioning society.
Yeah. And I think if anyone wants an example of a really good conversation that could have descended into name calling and insults, they could listen to that conversation between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and see, two people sparring for, what was it, an hour and a half, I think you said?
It was about an hour and 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, like they completely had diametrically opposed points of view, but never once did it get ugly, I don't think.
Right. Not to talk too much about the idea of long form conversations in podcasting, because I feel like specifically in that space it's talked about a lot, but I am very grateful for the way that podcasts and YouTube videos that can be hours long allow for the mass consumption of media that is really just long form intellectual conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I'm very grateful for the medium of podcasts and the ability to share videos online.
For sure. When you do your podcast, when you do an episode, when you have an idea that you want to debate with somebody, do you often or always argue your actual position, or do you intentionally try to argue the harder position, or how do you go about that?
That's a really good question. I'd say I do not always try to argue my position. That's the easier route for sure. But I really try to be accommodating to my guests. And what I've found is that guests are timid in the first place about advancing arguments. Then when they hear that I'm going to rake them over the coals, they're even more intimidated. So
Right.
I want to make them feel comfortable and say, look, whatever side of this you want to argue, like go for it, and I'll take the opposite side. And, to an extent, I think that I like to think of them more as conversations and less as debates. I see debates as sort of both sides advancing equal number of arguments in an equal span of time. And I see my job as one who's cross-examining another to really ask questions. And, in fairness, I do sneak some ideas in there and some arguments in there. But what I'm trying to do is listen to what my guest is saying and just unpack it and just try to poke my finger in there and look around and see if there might be any holes or inconsistencies.
Right. Absolutely. I think debate is another one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot and is defined differently by different people. I think the main thing for me is you can't win a conversation. You can win a debate, but you can't win a conversation. You're both just trying to learn as much as possible out of it.
Exactly. And I think maybe that's why I don't see it as a debate, because, at the end of a conversation, I always say, like, has your perspective changed in any way as a result of this conversation? And, people often say it has, to some degree. Maybe my opinion hasn't changed totally, but my perspective has. And I think about this in a new way. And that's, I think, a win, for everyone. And I feel so happy when that's the outcome of an episode. And that doesn't happen in debates. People sort of batten down the hatches, and I think they get even more sort of stronger in their camp at the end of a debate.
Yeah, I think they tend a little bit more towards extremism each time they have they can walk away from a debate just feeling frustrated and flustered that the other person can't possibly agree with them on everything.
Right. The other thing I think about debates, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I do love them. I love listening to Intelligence Squared and things like that. But I think that one of the challenges is both sides are really trying to advance as many arguments as they can. And so instead of responding to questions, I think people often just use a question, kind of like politicians do, as like a springboard to talk about their own issue.
I think often when people accuse politicians of dodging questions, I believe that happens. But the real issue is when they do that, when they springboard to an entirely different discussion. You can dodge a question. If they dodge a question, you can call them out on it, but not if they completely switch gears and now you're having a conversation about something else and someone else is trying to argue with them on that. It's too late to go back.
Yeah. I can tell you 33 episodes of this podcast has made me more forgiving of politicians that don't answer questions. And it's for this reason that I think very seldom do politicians intentionally choose not to answer a question and instead pivot to something else.
Right.
I think generally what I've found is that people generally are not great at answering questions. We all have so many ideas swirling around our head and so many things we want to say that we hear a phrase and it like clues us in to talk about this other thing. And so I don't think it's intentional is maybe what I'm getting at.
No, I'd never thought of it that way, but you're right. People are never comfortable. People, when they do an interview, will prepare answers to questions that are about their life, that they should be able to answer almost immediately if you wanted to work through it logically.
Right.
But the reality is you want to present it in the best, most understandable way possible.
Absolutely.
Naturally.
Yeah. So I don't think there's like, and I find this with my guests, I don't think there's much of a desire to evade questions. And sometimes people will say, remind me, what was the original question? And I just, I have to say, let's come back to my original question. I appreciate what you have to say, but like right now we're over here. So let's come back over here.
Right. If you're the host, I feel like you have to be the person to do that, to kind of to bring it back a little bit, especially if you're operating under a time constraint.
Yeah. I think what I've learned though is that that's sort of a unique way of thinking and that a lot of people just don't approach life in that linear fashion.
I think it's okay to let conversations go on and take whichever form or direction they need to, but it's about what they need. It's about what's best for the conversation, not just about what's more comfortable to talk about maybe.
Exactly.
I've had plenty of conversations with people where they will kind of eventually shy away from the topic and want to talk about something a little bit more casual, a little bit less idea focused, or maybe they just want to scroll through Reddit for a minute, kind of recoup,
Yeah.
Which is fine, but that's not what's best for the dialogue if we're trying to learn from one another.
Yeah. I think a lot about conversation, especially maybe a little more sparring conversations like what we have on Cross-Examine Life, kind of like sports games. And so if you think about, players working together to advance a football down a field, there's a certain way they have to do that. And as soon as one person starts checking Reddit when they're advancing the football down the field, like they've kind of gone, off the grid a little bit and they're no longer helpful to the team. So I sort of think about that as people are marshaling arguments together in support of their position. It's like, if this thing you're currently talking about doesn't advance the ball down the field of your argument, then like maybe you want to get off of it and come back to the main point.
I like that illustration. I also think it's even more, if we're being honest with ourselves about what we're talking about, I think it's more realistic if instead of a football, it's like a baby or something, or your baby, or your cat or your dog, or something that's really personally meaningful to you, because otherwise the illustration is like painting people as proponents of ideas. But the idea is that you want to figure out exactly how to get that ball to the other end of the field, and you want to synchronize it perfectly. But there's also the aspect that it should be something that's personally important to you, that you really believe, and that's the problem with debates as well, is people end up talking themselves into camps they wouldn't have thought themselves into otherwise, and now they're stuck there.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think that people, when they come on the show, especially, like, they have a position that's generally near and dear to their heart. And that's one of the things I love about the guests that I get. They're all very passionate about their ideas. And so whether we're talking about, free speech on the web being absolute, or, hate speech or Confederate monuments, people have these strong opinions, and they sort of almost treat them like little children. And it's like, this is my little being. This is the thing that I really believe in, and I'm going to nurture it, and I'm going to watch it grow, and hopefully it'll expand and really become a governing force in my life. And I think that a good argument can take that shape and can have that purpose.
Absolutely. So what's so far? You've been doing this since February of last year. It's a long time, man. Congrats.
Thanks.
What has been your favorite, or some of your favorite topics or conversations so far? Because I've listened to a couple episodes and haven't had time to listen to all of them, but what are maybe some recommendations?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I've found that I struggle with naming episodes. Trying to find something short and pithy that attracts people's attention is a challenge. And so episode 7 is about gentrification. And I think it's underrated. I think it's under-downloaded. And I think it needs a better name, because right now I have it titled, "Do We Want the Powerful Giving Themselves More Power?" And it's sort of clunky and cumbersome. But really, the issue of gentrification and the issue of the powerful giving themselves more powerful goes to the heart of what it is to be in a democracy. Either everyone has an equal voice and your vote matters as much as your next door neighbors, or you're living in something else that's not a democracy. Right. And the argument from those who are fighting for, reduction of or elimination of gerrymandering are really saying that in its current form, we're not living in a democracy because votes don't have equal power. And that was by design, by smart people relying on mathematicians and engineers and computer scientists who can draw really creative lines to make sure that some votes don't matter. And that is a really powerful allegation, so much so that it divided the Supreme Court. And I talk about the divisions of the Supreme Court that created in the beginning of that episode. So that's one of my favorites.
I love that, man. The key to democracy is the idea that there is no one group of people that is inherently knows better for the nation or the state than the rest of the people who live there, the rest of the citizens. I think that the not breaking down, but distortion of democracy has become such a commonly talked about topic, but not a commonly addressed or thought through topic. It's so interesting watching these things that would be considered not conspiracy theories, but very extreme topics of conversation kind of become something that we can just kind of joke about and apathetically laugh at, which I think is another barrier to having an actual conversation about it in the long run.
I know, before that conversation, I really thought it was like a tangential matter. I thought it was like a side issue, that one day maybe I would get to understanding and care about. And then it was actually after I heard another podcast called The Political Thicket. That's the name of the episode. The bigger podcast is called More Perfect. It's about Supreme Court cases. And this is just a little bit of a giveaway from the episode, both theirs and mine. But when a Supreme Court justice was retiring, Earl Warren, who was part of the Brown versus Board of Education court, he was asked what was the most influential and important decision of his tenure on the Supreme Court, and he didn't say Brown versus Board of Education. He said the case about gerrymandering.
Wow.
So
that's incredible.
It's a big deal. If I could recommend another one that I really love, it's episode 17. about copyrights. And that one does have a good title because it's simply Should Copyrights Exist? And what I love about that episode is that my guest was really bold and ambitious and brave. So we were at a philosophy conference with a bunch of philosophy professors whose job it is to publish articles and take credit for their publication of those articles.
Mm-hmm.
My guest wasn't a philosophy professor. She's just a sort of casual philosopher and a friend and a listener and a supporter of the show. And she took the position that copyrights shouldn't exist, that knowledge essentially at its very core is shared. There's no way to distinguish where ideas came from and at what point in your life you adopted ideas and from whom. And now when you put an idea on paper, is it really yours or is it a collection of all the ones that came before? So in this room full of philosophers, she's saying basically your jobs are kind of based in this thing that like shouldn't exist. And then what she agreed to was me bringing up members of the audience whose jobs rely on copyrights to come up and challenge her with tough questions, philosophy professors. And I would say, I'm a little biased, I'm not supposed to say this, but I would say that I think she had the best arguments in the room, and I didn't find or hear someone who advanced a better one than she did.
I just got chills, Chris. I need to listen to that episode. That's awesome. What were some of her arguments against copyright? Because this is a conversation that I've had at times, something I've thought through a little bit, and I'm just curious kind of what her points were.
Well, her biggest point was that when your copyright is taken or when your idea is quote unquote taken, you don't have any less of that thing. Mm-hmm. And that all of our crimes about theft are about depriving someone of the thing so that they don't have it anymore. And that's unfair. We can all agree that that's unfair. But, if you copy a music file, like the creator doesn't have less of that thing, arguably they might want reimbursement because now you are enjoying that thing that they created. But I think she sees other mechanisms of making sure that they get that reimbursement or that they get that credit. But she doesn't feel that there should be a sort of ability to, sue when someone is kind of stealing your idea. Because, I think she asked this tough question of like, when can you be sure they've taken your idea? When is it the likeness? If you make an argument in an essay, is that really yours? Or are you stealing from Descartes and Kant and Hegel and Socrates?
Right.
Yeah, they're good questions.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that has come up for me too in the argument is the fact that because of how exposed we are to advertisement and because of how connected our world is, there are so many ideas and symbols that are hammered into our head from the time that we're born that we eventually find out we don't have the legal rights to. The fact that I can recall the McDonald's logo, and I've known it since I was 2 or 3 years old, but I couldn't use it in an illustration if I wanted to without getting permission. But I didn't choose to put that idea there. I didn't choose what music I heard around me, but It had a huge impact on my personality, most likely, and on the way I think through things.
Yep. It's amazing that is, sort of prohibited from being used in your creative endeavors, even though it's part of your psyche.
Right. Did any of the philosophy professors get a little flustered or a little like, just, this is my livelihood, miss? This is my argument. It's my livelihood.
Yeah. I mean, they did. There was one person who was sort of saying like, this is the essence of like what we do. It's, we have to write. And I think his argument was a little more nuanced, and he was saying like, it takes time to do this and it is a lot of effort. And so we should be reimbursed for our effort. And if we're not, then we're going to stop doing these things. And I think it's making society a better place. And I'd probably agree with him. It is making society a better place. I do want him incentivized to, do that research and that publishing. But it like can't get away from the fact that, you're not left with any less of the thing if the thing is kind of taken from you.
Right. And I think it's easy too to, if you're defending copyright, to get caught up in the value of your own name, to the point where slapping your name on something is the reason that you're creating it or writing it or branding it in the first place. And I think that can be dangerous.
Absolutely. I mean, also, I think the fact that a copyright is essentially a race is silly. Two people are working on an idea and they split ways because they can't agree for some reason. And then they both sort of race to the patent office or the copyright office to sort of get that thing in before the other person. And it's like, comes down to a question of who has a faster mode of transportation. Seriously, what?
Right. It's interesting. I have an unrelated question if you're okay with switching topics.
Please.
Episode 18 is titled, Should Children Be Allowed to Vote? I have a friend who's coming on the podcast next month to talk a little bit about this. This isn't the main topic, but it's something that we've talked about and that I think she has an interesting position on. What was there a conclusion on this? What are some of the main ideas that came up to kind of prepare me for that? Because I think it's a very interesting conversation. I think as young people, because of the internet, largely are able to become involved in politics at an earlier age or getting involved in activism in their teens, like early teens now. You know, I had a friend who was 14 and went to one of the protests in Ferguson. And I just thought that was fascinating. But at the same time, she's told that she should wait and vote, and that's how the change should happen, but she can't vote, and she has this kind of pent up frustration because the information is there.
Yeah. No, it's a great question and a great issue. Just as a preliminary matter about all the podcasts, there is a one position sort of advanced by my guest for each topic. I don't know that I could say that there's a conclusion sort of for any of them. We each kind of have our, opposing points of view. But in that one, the guest did argue that children should be allowed to vote. And I think the positions that advanced in support of that argument were that information is more readily available than it ever has been in the past, as you were alluding to, and that, children are capable of digesting that, particularly, kids in their teens who aren't 18 yet, but are perfectly capable of understanding some basic issues. And I think one of the great arguments made in that episode was, look, we have adults who put zero effort into research and they show up at the voting polls just because they're permitted to, and they make poor decisions based on no information. If you allowed kids to vote, they would probably do the exact opposite. School suggests they would do the exact opposite. Research suggests they would do the exact opposite. Just the fact that they have a new right afforded to them suggests the opposite.
Right. Well, do you think that over several decades, that enthusiasm for a new right would die out, and then they would be making the same kind of poor decisions their parents are?
Yes, I to a degree, I think that the enthusiasm would die out. Would they be making the same poor decisions? I think they'd probably follow in their parents' footsteps a lot. But also, don't forget, when do teenagers start rebelling? 13, 14, 15?
Right.
You might find some independent decision making around that time, especially if it's like the one area of life that a 13-year-old can exercise independent decision making.
I've also heard people argue that the voting age should be raised to 25 or 26 or somewhere around there. But it always sounds like that argument is happening with the same intention or for the same reasons, because they believe that people who are younger, who are in the 18 to 24 range, aren't making the wisest decisions, and that it should be raised to favor the positions of older Americans.
Yeah, I guess I would just ask people thinking through this issue to consider how long it took the Bible to be translated out of Latin and into people's vernacular languages. 1,600 years, 1,700 years of its existence before there was actually trust that regular everyday people could read words of scripture and make sense of them for themselves. And before that, it was guarded. It was like, no, you can't. You couldn't possibly be trusted to understand these mysteries. Don't even attempt it. We're going to keep it in Latin just to make sure that you don't try to understand. And I don't know. It's sort of...
I see the similarity there. The level of gatekeeping and of distrust and then requesting trust.
Yeah. I think there's also an argument too. So long as the lifespan of individuals has grown extensively over the last couple of decades, people have to live with the outcomes of their votes longer. And so it might have been in the past that you start voting at 18 and you only have to live with the consequences of that for, 4 or 5 decades. Well, now you might be living with the consequences into your 90s or 100s. And shouldn't you be able to influence that future earlier? That seems to me like a compelling argument. Like, if you're going to sort of have to live with the consequences longer, then you should have a greater voice in them. And one way to give a greater voice is to sort of start having that voice earlier.
I think so. What do you think? This is just related because you brought up age. You brought up the changing of the increasing on average of the American lifespan or of the Western lifespan. The average, I think, the average age of death for an American male right now, I think, is still 73 or something like that, which seems low. But what do you think the ideal age at which to die is?
It's a really good question. I would
Sorry for the
say
180, but I had to ask.
no, it's fine. Based on the two podcasts episodes that I did about death and people who took competing views about when you should die, I would say when you no longer want to be living and when you no longer have something to live for, because the people that are important to you have either gone out of your life or your mind has sort of deteriorated to such a point where you don't understand why it is you're living and what the things are around you. And I know that sounds crazy and remote, but in my mid 30s, I know several individuals in that position right now, and it's a real problem. And
Right.
there's a lot of conversations about
exactly.
whether or not that's a life worth living for the individual who's living it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a hard place to be. I don't disagree that people, that when you've come to the point where your life is just no longer enjoyable, no longer has value to you, that it might be time to go. But I think that even reaching that point can be dangerous, because if I increasingly, I don't know what the statistics are, but increasingly Americans don't believe in the idea of an afterlife. And that's something that I've struggled with off and on throughout my life, that conversation. I think that if there is not one, then ending your life on a note of like, well, this sucks, I don't want to be here anymore, it is pretty existentially depressing. The ancient Greeks believed that, I can't remember what the story was. There was a story of two boys who made some great accomplishment, and their mother was interviewed, and she said that she wishes her two sons could just lie down and die right now in the midst of all this glory. And I think that's a compelling idea that we've kind of lost sight of, because life seems so comfortable to us now. There's so little strife in our daily lives that we would rather it just go on forever, than acknowledge that we need to figure out what we're here to do or to accomplish, do that thing. And then if it gets us killed, it does. And if it doesn't, we need to keep doing things that we are supposed to do until one of them either gets us killed or until we're content. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where I'm at with that. Yeah. If doing the thing doesn't result in some kind of demise, and most likely it won't, then, does one take their own life? No, I don't think that's the answer. But I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the idea of living until life isn't worth living, even just reaching the beginning stages of that condition.
Yeah, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, check out episodes 15 and 16 of Cross-Examine Life, where in 15, a gentleman argues that you should live life to its natural conclusion and not try to hasten it at all. And in 16, the guest argues that maybe death isn't as big of a problem as we think it is. And maybe we're all a little too afraid of this thing that's been happening to our ancestors for millennia, and we just need to stop pushing it off.
It's a natural part of a natural process. Who knows what happens if we reach a point scientifically where humans can become immortal or have ridiculously long lifespans? Who knows what kind of worldly natural processes we're throwing off, like
sure,
nitrogen levels in the soil, for instance, because we're not burying people.
Right. Yeah.
As just a small example. I would agree that death isn't really a problem that we need, that needs fixing, because it's always kind of been a part of our existence. But I'll definitely check out those episodes.
Yeah, it's one of the few times where I've had sort of opposing points of view on back-to-back episodes.
Right. That's cool. I'll listen to one, jump over to the other. I'll find one compelling and then have everything shattered. That'd be good.
Yeah, you'll find yourself shouting at your phone for the second one.
All right. I made a list of what I think are compelling, somewhat out of the ordinary questions. It seemed like a good idea to kind of just run through these with you and get your take on them, so people can hear you articulate your stance on difficult or out of the ordinary topics, since that's what a decent part of your podcast is about, despite the fact that it's more of a conversational disagreement focus podcast. I think a lot of it is articulation of ideas, and I think it would be nice for my listeners to get kind of a preview of that, and for me to kind of get to engage in that with you.
Great.
Awesome. Question number 1: can time have a beginning?
I think it's impossible for something that we understand to have no end to have a beginning. I've not seen any compelling arguments for why time would come to a close. Even if matter ceased to exist, the timeline along which it has existed would continue chugging forward. And again, I haven't heard any compelling reasons why that wouldn't be the case. So I'm going to say time has neither a beginning nor an end.
Mm-hmm. I think we assign beginning and ends to stories and to so many things in our lives to try to make sense of things, that we assume that has to be the case for the universe around us. We kind of are putting our own human shadow on the stars, and I think that's a little inappropriate.
Absolutely. We always need to study the finite thing in front of us. And so in order to take an infinite thing and study it, we make it finite by talking about events. But even when you talk about events, you get into sticky and uncharted territory when you try to describe when they began, when they ended.
Mm-hmm.
When did your childhood end? Well, it gets a little sticky.
Yeah, I'd say mine's still going strong. Question number 2: is free will possible? Are you an advocate of free will or not?
I very much believe that every human has the ability to make choices independent of their biology or spirituality. I think that we all have impulses that arise as a result of our biology and our socialization. We might have impulses that arise as a result of our spirituality. I don't think any of those are controlling. And I think if you want to see examples of why I believe that, you can just look at heroes and people who have been outspoken critics or advocates or leaders, and you'll see that they have found a way to swim upstream. And they found a way to feel those tendencies, whether they be biological or spiritual, and do the opposite of what those tendencies would kind of steer them towards. So, yeah, I think that we're able to make all sorts of decisions, no matter how much they grate against or go against the grain that we were born with.
Interesting. I think that's a great way of describing or defending it, bringing up the idea of heroes who disrupt the fabric of the society that they were born into, or disrupt the circumstances around them, whether those circumstances be social, cultural, or even genetic circumstances. I think that's a great argument for that. I generally tend towards not being a proponent of free will. I think that even those heroes, even those people who go against the fabric of society or of their perceived reality, are being pushed forward by every experience they've had in their life, every genetic factor of their existence, and every psychological factor, every social input that they've gotten that have been either subconscious or conscious. And then they're making ideas based on that. So I think the ideas themselves are just the results of natural processes. I think that if I were someone else and I experienced their life exactly the way that they did, I would be that person. I wouldn't still be myself making decisions as me. But I think it's important to treat each other as if we have free will, and to treat justice as if we have free will, and to relate to one another in that way, because otherwise we can't hold each other accountable for anything, or trust each other, or even respect one another if I see you as just the culmination of natural processes that have taken place in your life. So although I fundamentally disagree with the material existence of free will, I agree that as an idea, it's important. It's one of the best ideas we've come up with, and it's the precursor for relating to one another in a respectful manner.
Can you say the one line again, just that was a subset of what you just said, related to if you were someone else, things would be similar or the same?
Yeah, I believe that if I were Chris Tatem, if I lived Chris Tatem's life, I would be Chris Tatem on every level. There would be no remnants of Jeshua's soul or ideas or anything like that. I believe that because of the genetic and at the beginning, the genetic circumstances, but then also the cultural and social and psychological circumstances. I believe that I would 100% be Chris Tatum, making every decision, speaking every word that you're speaking and making right now.
So I just want to push back on that and challenge a little bit and say,
Sure.
given what we understand about physics and what we understand about the sort of shifting nature of our material universe, isn't it likely that given the range of micro events over the course of someone's day or the course of someone's week or year, that each of those micro events gives rise to a decision? And a lot of times those decisions aren't conscious, they're unconscious. And they're things that you do partly as a result of how you were, brought up in your biology, but partly as a result of just like that moment in time being the way things are. And so I just wonder if maybe a book had been left out of place, if you would have walked the opposite direction at a moment in time and you would have gone on to have a different life because that book was left out of place. I'm not sure. I guess I wonder, are you, that you really would have the same life as me if other things were shifting in your surroundings that could cause your life to go in the opposite direction and present you with a whole different range of choices that I never had?
Right. I think the decisions themselves are the result of experience, given the fact that when we're infants, we don't really know what to do with ourselves at all outside of instinct. But then I wouldn't know how to defend the existence of instinct, I guess, too, because of the fact that I would say decisions are the result of experiences. Instincts themselves would have to be some kind of outlying psychological factor that isn't really accounted for.
Yeah, interesting.
So, that's me kind of picking apart my own myself, I guess.
No, it's good. I like the introspection there, and perhaps that's a topic we can revisit in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Question number 3: is life hard?
Life is absolutely hard. I think it's the hardest thing that humans are asked to overcome. It's harder than being born. It's harder than giving birth. Living a life where you are in relationship with other people, perhaps a spiritual being, and the world around you, the natural world, and trying to keep those things in balance and trying to find things that satisfy you while being true to yourself and your values, I think is the hardest thing in the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A life lived alone would be absolutely miserable, but would be a little bit easier in some ways than a life lived in a society. But that's what's ideal for us. We exist to be in community together and to figure out not just what's best for us, but what's best for the group, for the culture, for the world. Because in a larger sense, if we can look outside of ourselves and say, "Oh, I think this is good for my neighbor," then it's probably good for you too in some way you just can't fully grasp.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know where to strike the balance, where you can find a sweet spot between self-interest and, some kind of global activism for humanity.
Yeah. And I do want to say that I want to push back a little bit on your assertion that a life lived alone might be easier and say
In
that
some ways.
Well, okay. I guess I just wanted to say that we're relational beings by our very DNA and our evolution, and that to live alone, you're still going to find yourself in dialogue and in a relationship, but the only person that you have to be in dialogue with and relationship with is yourself. And if you want to see what that looks like when it happens for too long, look at the character Gollum on Lord of the Rings. He is the essence of living by yourself
Right.
and only speaking with yourself and being in relation with yourself. And I think it's a horrible spiral of selfishness and kind of self-loathing that
Right.
is inevitable.
It might seem easier at first to someone who's naturally more introverted, but when it's put into practice, eventually you need to spend time with other people, because otherwise you're not going to learn. You're not going to be able to restrain yourself. You become unaware socially, from what jokes aren't funny to how to not hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, question number 4. Is suffering a choice?
Sometimes it is. We certainly make decisions that lead to suffering and that increase suffering in the world, both for ourselves and for others. But I think that there is some suffering that is wrought upon us that is independent of our own making. And I think that the same is true of luck. When someone has success in a job, that might be because they put a lot of effort in and did a really good job that they're rewarded for. But it could also be the case that, out of luck, the company makes a really good sale and now has lots of bonus money to distribute. That says nothing about the individual employee if they don't work in the division that had the good sale. They just kind of lucked out. And so I think that sort of luck and suffering are analogs in a lot of ways, and exist both as a result of our decisions and independent from them.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that suffering, in a natural sense, is part of the human condition, right? It's tragedy is part of our natural existence, and suffering is a component of that. And sometimes it is a choice, either indirectly because of some decision we made earlier in life that we didn't fully understand, or directly because we're completely refusing to pull ourselves out of a hole that we could easily reach our arms through.
Absolutely.
But there are circumstances where it's a lot more complicated than that. If you're at 0, it's a lot different than being at 1.
Right.
So, question number, I don't know what number this is. 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be question number 5.
5. Great.
Question number 5. Do you think it is more likely than not that we are living in a simulation, Chris Tatem?
I think it's less likely than not that we're living in a simulation. I think that the feelings that we have, the sensations, the emotional responses that we have, many people describe them as cutting us to our core, as cutting us in half sometimes as a human being. Some people have had reactions that simply strike them dead because it's such a shocking thing to their understanding of the world or to their psyche. Like if they've lost a child, we've heard of stories of people dying on the spot. I think those reactions that involve our entire being physically and psychologically and emotionally tell us that there's something deeper than hardwired programming going on, and that we're actually masters of our own mini destinies.
I had to pause for a second just to let that sink in with everybody. I couldn't agree more. I think that it's interesting how widely accepted the simulation theory idea has been within probably the past 4 or 5 years. It's kind of come into the public conversation a lot. I think that it is largely the result of it's almost religious in nature. The idea of we don't know, this is a lack of information. We don't know why we're here. We don't know fundamentally what the universe is made of, apart from what we can understand about matter. So potentially it's a simulation. We live in a world of rapidly advancing technology, so we assume that one day we'll be able to simulate some kind of smaller reality, and that if we can do that, then this must be what that is, but on a larger scale. I think that is another form of taking our shadow and casting it onto the stars, saying, I can't fully understand the world, but I bet my being does,
Sure. And I would love to make a video game and direct the characters inside of it. So I'm sure I must be an example of that.
I would love to do that too. Oh my gosh. I feel like 6 years ago or so, there was word about this video game that was just going to encompass all of human history up to this point. And I kept seeing blog posts about it, and then I never heard about it again. Did you ever hear about that?
I didn't. But as a sort of early adopter of computers, when the first, personal computers came out in the early 90s, I can tell you one of the first games to really blow up was SimCity. And that was because you could make your own little universe. And so I just think that message and that idea, as you said, is almost religious in nature. It sort of taps into something very deep inside of all of us, this desire to make our own little microcosm. And I think that's why we have families. And I think that's why people get pets. And I think that that's why people love libraries full of books, because it's your own little microcosm of the world that makes sense to you. And that's what makes us comfortable. And so we surround ourselves with that.
Right. It's why we decorate our homes and have websites.
Yeah.
And Twitter profiles and all that jazz.
Indeed.
I think two more questions.
Okay.
Also, did you play Spore? Did you ever play Spore?
No.
You would love it. You should play Spore. It's available on PC. You'll have to get like an old version of it. It's from probably 10 years ago or so at least, but it's a great game. You
Okay.
start out as a cell, and then by the end of it, you're exploring the cosmos.
Oh, cool.
It's fascinating. Should humans manipulate other species for our benefit? Genetically modified organisms, whether that be plants or animals, should there be a line drawn? Where should the line be drawn? If so, does it end with animals? Does it end with certain people? Where do you draw the line?
Yes, I think modifying other organisms for our benefit is fine. I have no problem using animals for that purpose. And I think that the line should be drawn between Animalia and humans to the extent that humans are not a member of that kingdom. So I would not want to see sort of those tests or kind of biochemical tests and extractions done from humans or pre-humans, but I'm okay with it being done from animals.
Right. I think that's the most common sense place to draw the line, at least in the context of a Western worldview, in the idea of separating ourselves from animals and separating ourselves ethically from the rest of the world that we are supposed to contain and in some sense have dominion over. I think that makes the most sense. I think that oftentimes when someone is arguing too far one way or the other, it's one of the byproducts of being attached to a more extreme ideology that maybe they don't fully understand, but that they're being sucked into. You know, you go too far towards apathy, then you're suggesting suddenly that we should be conducting tests on people, that we should be trying to eliminate mental illness by doing this, and then you go too far the opposite direction, and suddenly you can't eat anything.
Right. I was going to say, I'm a big fan of slippery slope arguments, and I know they're not considered the strongest in philosophy, but I think they have their place. And I think that if you're going to object to tests or extractions of things from, gorillas or other animals that people might argue are similar to humans, you also have to stop using the shampoo you are, and you have to make sure you don't step on ants anymore. And I'm just not willing to live in that world. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
where I fall.
I have a friend. His name is Yao Yuing. He's a Tibetan Buddhist, and I was very careful around him not to crush spiders or bugs or anything like that. And then one time we were outside of his house, and there was this centipede on the ground, and I was very careful. I kind of just backed away from it, and it was huge. It wasn't a millipede; it was just a centipede, but it was intimidating. So I back up a little bit, and then he comes over and just smiles and stomps on it, and I thought, huh. That's interesting. How I was more afraid of offending your beliefs than you are actually convicted by them.
Yeah.
So it was very fascinating. Okay, I have one more question for you, Chris Tatem.
All right.
What's your favorite breakfast food and why?
French toast, hands down, with whipped cream and maple syrup, 7 days a week.
Sounds delicious. That's that's an IHOP situation right there.
Well, IHOP if you need it in a pinch, but homemade is always going to be the best. You can even put heavy cream in the egg and cinnamon mixture, and I like to add some maple syrup, both to that mixture and to the whipped cream as I'm making the whipped cream.
Have you ever had peanut butter on French toast?
I don't think so. It seems like a mixing of metaphors. I don't know.
A mixing of metaphors. It's delicious. I promise. It tastes way less metaphorical than it sounds.
Okay. Are we talking about peanut butter and maple syrup?
I didn't have maple syrup on mine, but I had a friend with me who did put maple syrup on it. I feel like
toasted bread with peanut butter, sign me up for. I'm just talking about something that ought to have maple syrup and whipped cream on it. I'm not sure I'm also going to involve peanut butter in that situation.
Okay. I might introduce a little peanut butter and just take the maple syrup out of the equation. I think if you've got maple syrup and peanut butter combined, you just don't want to eat anything the rest of the day, probably.
That's right. I agree. We can agree about that.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for coming on. If you want to go ahead and plug the podcast again real quick, this was great. I enjoyed having a conversation with you. I think your answers to the questions were phenomenal. Thanks for being a good sport in that.
Of course. I enjoyed this very much.
Thanks, man. I look forward to talking with you more in the future, potentially. This was great.
I would love that. I think you'd be a great guest on Cross-Examine Life, and I'm sure we could have a fascinating conversation about free will or any of the other topics that we, lightly touched on today.
That would be great, man. I would love that.
Yeah, certainly if guests, want to hear more conversations along these lines and want to hear even more sort of sparring disagreement, they could check out Cross-Examine Life wherever they get podcasts. And, we mentioned some of my favorite episodes, episode 17 about copyrights and episode 11 about terrorism. But many of them are good. So take a browse, see what you like, and reach out and let me know. Certainly, if people want to be a guest on the show, I'm always open to folks who want to come on and advance some position.
And what's the Twitter handle or the Instagram handle for your podcast?
Sure. So you can find us on Twitter at CEL Podcast, stands for Cross Examine Life. And we also have a private Facebook community where we discuss some of the arguments. That's a Cross Examine Life community on Facebook.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Chris. This was a lot of fun.
Jeshua, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.